Hey, right, in this video I want to talk about the new Euro 5 Plus or Euro 5B emissions regulations that are coming into the force on the 1st of January 2025. New emissions regulations which are going to affect what models of motorcycles are available to some of us. In fact, it has all sorts of repercussions for motorcyclists and for motorcycle manufacturers going forward. And I'll get onto that in just a moment. First of all, this clip that we're watching at the moment, I published this in my Royal Enfield Shotgun 650 video on Friday, and once again the trolls were out in force. I lost count of the amount of comments about the fact that I stopped the motorcycle on a roundabout. Now, we're all drivers, we're all riders. This was by no means a rare occurrence. I mean, granted, it's not something you do every day on every trip, but it is something that crops up quite regularly. Now, a lot of these comments, the language was horrendous. I was showered with insults. Some of them had to be removed because of YouTube guidelines. And apart from some of the comments, the basic consensus seemed to be, I don't know the law, I don't know how to ride a motorcycle, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm an idiot. Now, I would like to point out, I am a retired police motorcyclist, which means regarding 99.99% of those commenters, my credentials and qualifications for riding a motorcycle and driving a car are far superior to yours. Okay, I'm not perfect, and I've had a lot of sleeps since my last riding course. But if I do happen to stop on a roundabout, I'm doing it for a very good reason. Let's have a look what it was, shall we? That was an ambulance heading towards the hospital carrying someone whose life obviously was in danger and time was of the essence. Keep your brain dead comments to yourself. Right, Euro emissions. These began in the early 1990s with catalytic converters mandated for integration into motor cars to start curbing the amount of harmful emissions from motor traffic, which at that time, as now, was on the increase. It started with Euro 1 emissions legislation, and every few years they up the ante on it. Basically, I think cars are now at Euro 6 or Euro 7. Because motorcycles are statistically a very tiny number of the overall motor traffic on the roads, emissions regulations weren't integrated into motorcycle design until I think it was 1999. Again, starting at Euro 1 for motorcycles, and we're now at Euro 5. Now, before all the brain-dead comments start coming in about the fact that the UK has left Europe, so this shouldn't affect us, the UK government adopted the Euro regulations back in the early 1990s, and they have retained them, so unless they tell us otherwise, we are still going to be bound here in the UK by this Euro 5 Plus or Euro 5B regulation. So are all the EU countries, and believe it or not, a huge proportion of the rest of the world is also going to find itself bound by these regulations as well. Because although most countries have introduced their own equivalent of these emission regulations, most of them are based on the EU regulations themselves. I mean, after all, what is the point of spending millions and millions of pounds creating your own set of regulations when someone else in Europe has already done it for you? They may have a different title, but they amount to a very, very similar thing. So, generally speaking, any vehicle that meets current EU emissions regulations can be sold in any other country because it either meets or exceeds their expected standards. So, with some exceptions, the current Euro emissions regulations tend to be accepted in every country. To some extent this is staggered because some countries are behind Europe, but financially, once a manufacturer has sort of developed and researched this equipment to be put on board a vehicle, it doesn't make a lot of sense to remove it from some markets. So these emission standards tend to migrate all over the world. Legislation in Brussels tends to affect everyone. Just going back to the early 1990s when the advent of catalytic converters first came about, I was sort of into my cars at the time, as well as motorcycles, and this raised a lot of concern. At that time, and I think we're talking about 1992, the cost of a catalytic converter would add about £600 onto the purchase price of your average car. Bearing in mind that a basic family car could be had for around about £6,000 or £7,000 at the time. And then, as it is now, catalytic converters don't last forever. They have a limited lifetime, just like an exhaust system. They become clogged and ineffective. In some cases where the vehicle's been used to the full extent of its performance, they even burn out prematurely. Now, emissions testing at the MOT stage isn't carried out on motorcycles here in the UK at the moment, but it has been on cars for a long time. So if your vehicle fails its emission test at MOT, the likely culprit is the fact that your catalytic converter has passed its sell-by date and needs to be replaced. And I know I have, and I'm sure you have all had conversations, or maybe even experienced it yourself, with disgruntled motorists who've had to fork out a hefty amount of cash for a replacement catalytic converter when it comes to an MOT. I've no idea what the cost now. I presume it's probably model and manufacturer specific, but it is not unknown for it to cost over £1,000 to have a catalytic converter replaced. But the situation for motorcyclists is slightly different. There is no emissions testing at MOT currently. So for your average motorcycle owner, it doesn't really matter if your catalytic converter becomes ineffective or burns out. You can continue to run the bike anyway, and there's no legislation in place to stop you from doing so, or at least there wasn't until now. Now, in the Western world, motorcycles are a very small part of road traffic. They're a tiny contributor to, environmental pollution. Not just because compared to cars there aren't that many of them around, but also because, the frugal machines, they don't use an awful lot of fuel. They're small, they're relatively light, so the pressure they put on the environment is much lower than that of a car. And it's also important to point out that historically, in modern times, air pollution in the UK is at, I won't say all-time low, but a historical low. The last time that airborne pollution in the UK was at this level was prior to 1880. That's 144 years ago. Air quality is the best it's been for 144 years. Now, politicians don't like motorists. They like to blame everything they possibly can on motorists. They like motorcyclists even less. These Euro 5 Plus or Euro 5B regulations apply only to motorcycles, not to cars. The parameters of the emissions regulations aren't changing per se, i.e. they're not tightening up further on the amount of emissions that a motorcycle is capable of emitting. That's staying the same as standard Euro 5. The new Euro 5 Plus or B regulation pertains to the lifespan of the catalytic converter. Now, that's all well and good, but it seems to me that this is shot being fired at performance motorcycles. As you know, I'm not a great fan of performance motorcycles, but we have performance cars, we have performance motorcycles. Everyone has the right to choose what they ride. This new legislation will only apply to motorcycles capable of travelling faster than 130 kilometres per hour. That's just under 81 miles per hour. Royal Enfield have obviously been well aware that this was coming. Their biggest selling models, the J-Platform 350s, are restricted at the ECU to 74 or 75 miles per hour. Something which a lot of people complain about, but I've always said that this has been done for a reason, and it's probably down to emissions standards. Well, we've got the answer now. They've kept the top speed well under 80 or 81 miles per hour to make sure that these models don't fall foul of this new legislation. They've known it's coming for a while. I suspect other sort of small to medium capacity motorcycle manufacturers have also been aware of it, but they've continued to chase the numbers until it becomes an acute problem, which it now has. You would assume that if the lifespan of the emissions control system is now under scrutiny, that the European Union, or certainly here in the UK, they would follow the same model that they followed with cars, where annually here in the UK the emissions are tested on a car. If it fails, it has to be corrected. I know the rest of Europe is a bit of a hodgepodge. Some countries don't have the equivalent of an MOT test. In some countries it's every 2 years. But you would think that if the EU was concerned about the longevity of catalytic converters on motorcycles, they would make it mandatory for them to be tested every 1 or 2 years for emissions so that these problems can be spotted. That is the most logical and fair way of approaching the problem. But instead, with this new legislation, what they've decided to do is put the onus on the manufacturer and the motorcycle owner by incorporating hardware and software into any new model registered after the 1st of January next year, which will monitor the health of the catalytic converter. And if the catalytic converter doesn't pass that test, which has to be carried out every few miles, it will automatically put the bike into limp mode, and the owner will not be able to return it to normal operating service until that problem, i.e. a replacement of the catalytic converter, has been rectified. Now, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't see why motorcycles and motorcyclists should be treated differently from car drivers, but like I say, I think this is a shot fired directly at high-powered motorcycles to get them off the road. Because for a motorcycle manufacturer, it's not as simple as this might seem. Now, currently, in order for a motorcycle to comply with the current emissions regulations, the vehicle has to be capable of passing an emissions test at the time of registration or manufacture. What happens after that doesn't matter. It's not contained within the legislation. It has to pass a test that puts the vehicle through normal operating conditions. This is a predetermined, if you like, operation of the throttle to normal throttle openings to ensure that it stays within the parameters that are legislated, which is a very similar test to what cars are expected to pass during an MOT. But, as manufacturers have pointed out, that particular test isn't very realistic. If the owner, for instance, let's just say for the sake of argument, takes his bike to a track day, his bike at high speeds under full throttle load is likely to produce emissions that would exceed what is currently allowed. Plus, because of the use that he's putting that motorcycle to on that track day, he's liable to irreparably damage the catalytic converter, which would require its replacement. So, under this new Euro 5 Plus or 5B legislation, he would then have an expensive bill at the end of that track day to have his bike rectified before he can take it back on the road. And let's face it, there are a lot of idiots on motorcycles who behave as though they're on a track day when they're riding on the road, so they're going to fall foul of the same problem. And what some motorcycle manufacturers are telling us is that some performance motorcycles simply cannot be made to comply with this legislation, so they're going to have to remove them at least from the UK and European market. Bikes like the R1. And those that can be made to comply are going to be a lot more expensive. But don't forget, a catalytic converter doesn't last forever, no matter how you use your vehicle. Now, the current projections are that you can reasonably expect, with some modification and money, you can make a catalytic converter last about 27,500 miles, or maybe a little bit more. But inevitably, it is going to fill. So the value of medium-high mileage motorcycles is going to fall substantially. They become a ticking time bomb for a prospective purchaser of a second-hand motorbike. A bit like an electric vehicle with its batteries, you've got no idea how long it's going to last once you've bought it. And how long it's going to last before it needs a new catalytic converter and goes into limp mode is like asking how long a piece of string is. It's all down to how that bike has been treated by its previous owner or owners, and it becomes a big gamble. It also creates enormous problems for the manufacturer, because if they can't make these bikes last, they're going to face a lot of warranty claims and maybe even litigation from owners whose motorcycles haven't lasted as long as they could reasonably expect them to. It's going to substantially push up the cost of any new motorcycle that's capable of exceeding 80 miles per hour. And depreciation of those motorcycles is going to be much bigger and much faster. Now, I know that in some territories, and this is actually something that keeps coming up in comments, legislation built into vehicles in the hardware and software. As I've said, often it's just not economical for, say, a European manufacturer to build a completely different vehicle to one that is supplying in the European Union, as opposed to one that is supplying to the American market. So what they tend to do is, at the factory, although this equipment is installed, they just disable it or switch it off. And as we all know, software is not the most reliable human invention. I regularly get comments from especially US owners of European vehicles who, you know, as the vehicles get older, these redundant systems start to cause problems with the vehicle, which quite often can be very expensive to rectify. So, like I say, it does tend to affect everyone. I don't know exactly how this is going to pan out, but as I've said, some of the big Japanese manufacturers of motorcycles have already stated that they're going to withdraw certain models from the European and UK market, because it's just not possible to reliably make them compliant. And where rev limiters are concerned, I mean, most motorcycles are fitted with them now. I think we're going to see the rev ceiling lowered considerably on a lot of the high-powered bikes that are left and sold in those markets, because, you know, the manufacturers are going to have to do something to safeguard themselves. But what I certainly think we are going to see, and it's going to start in Europe and gradually spread everywhere else, is a gradual demise of high-powered machines. And if I'm honest, I think that's exactly what this legislation is intended to do. Now, very few publications are reporting on this. Initially, I only had my attention drawn to, I think it was Visor Down who published an article on it. There's so little information out there that at first I thought this might actually be an April Fool's joke, but then I did find it somewhere else. I'll try and find the links to both of those and put them in the video description down below for you to read if you wish to do so. But it's not good news for motorcycling at large. I mean, really, anything over 300 or 400 cc's is likely to be affected by this legislation unless the manufacturers quite simply restrict the performance. We are now entering the age of the small capacity motorcycle. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. You could show your appreciation by leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you're not already a subscriber. And even if you are a subscriber, check that you are still subscribed. I'm still getting daily reports from people that they're constantly being unsubscribed from the channel, or the notifications have been switched off and they've got no idea why. The other way you could help, if you wish to do so, is through donations via the super thanks button down below, or via my Patreon page. Either way, your assistance is much appreciated. I am, of course, going to be back on Friday, so until then, please, ride safely, and I'll see you soon.